Hello marine biology students. In this video, we're going to talk about the different types of coral reefs and a bit about the ecology of coral reefs as well. So there are three basic types of coral reefs based on their shape and their relationship to shore. These reefs are fringing reefs, barrier reefs, and atolls. The fringing reefs are the simplest and most common form of reef. They develop as narrow strips along the shore. They consist of an inner reef flat of varying width and an outer reef slope. And between these two, we have the reef crest. With that reef crest being the peak between. The growth of the coral is typically more intense on the outer reef slope. The growth is slower on the reef flat due to runoff from land, which includes sediments, freshwater, and pollution. So here we can see a fringing reef. Usually it's adjacent to shore, and that will be some extension of the reef flat. After the reef crest, we'll see the reef slope, where there will be more diverse coral growth. You'll also notice sediment and rubble at the bottom of the reef slope. A barrier reef is just slightly different. They also develop along coasts, yet they are often farther from shore than the fringing reef. The difference with a barrier reef is that a deep lagoon is found between shore and the reef crest. Waves often wash sediment onto the back reef slope or reef flat, which causes reduced coral growth. Enough sediment may accrue to form small islands on the reef. And we call these keys, and it can be spelled in two different ways. Famous barrier reefs include the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, or also in Belize off the coast of Central America. The biggest difference between a barrier reef and a fringing reef has to do with that lagoon between the beach and the reef crest. Here we can see abundant coral growth that would be on the outer reef slope. The last category of coral reef are the atolls, and an atoll is a circular reef surrounding a central lagoon. Sand keys and islands may be a part of the atoll. The width of the atoll varies from less than a mile to even over 20 miles. The inner slope within the lagoon has a more gradual slope than the outer slope. The lagoon also normally has a depth of 200 feet or less. The two largest atolls are in the Maldives and the Marshall Islands. When we look at an atoll, we can see the very steep outer slopes of the fore reef, and then that more shallow back reef slope making up the lagoon. Within the lagoon, you may find pinnacles of coral growth, in addition to sand keys along the edge. These structures are very mysterious and puzzled scientists for a while as to how they were formed, because often they are not close to any other land, and yet the coral reefs are growing right at the surface. The person who accurately described how coral atolls are formed is actually Charles Darwin. Atolls begin developing when a volcanic island is formed. This hypothesis, first presented by Charles Darwin, is now supported by a wide body of evidence. Around this volcanic island, a fringing reef begins to form. An interesting property of volcanic islands is that they are quite heavy, and they actually cause the oceanic plate beneath them to begin to subside locally. So after this volcanic island is formed, it very slowly begins to sink. Conversely, the coral reef grows upwards, and if the rate of the coral reef's growth matches that of the volcanic island's subsidence, eventually the island itself will continue to go down and down, just leaving this ring-shaped reef. So the island subsides while the coral reef continues to grow. The island eventually disappears. Below the water surface, leaving only the outer band of coral surrounding a lagoon. The round fringing reef becomes an atoll. And at these atolls, there is no remaining evidence of that volcanic island except for the presence of this coral ring. They did drilling studies, and they actually had to drill down several hundred meters in order to find evidence of the volcanic island that used to be at the surface. So here we see that formation process. And again, by the time the atoll is formed, the original island is buried under a mountain of calcium carbonate. Coral reefs are very interesting ecosystems because they are very diverse and productive, and yet they are also nutrient poor. So coral reefs are among the most biodiverse and productive ecosystems on Earth. The coral reef ecosystem is very complex and limited by many physical features such as light, depth, nutrients, wave action, etc., and many biological limits as well, including competition, predation, and grazing. Warm tropical waters where reef develop are low in nutrients, primarily phosphates and nitrates, due to stratification of the water column and distance from rivers and other sources of nutrients. Due to low nutrient content, the water surrounding reefs has very low primary production. They're poor in phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton isn't excessively abundant. The food web is basically based around the primary production of the zooxanthellae within the coral. They can also be found in some other invertebrates as well, such as anemones and even giant clams. The coral benefits the zooxanthellae by providing carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and phosphorus in its excretory products. The zooxanthellae is then able to provide organic molecules to the corals and to all the animals that feed on the corals. So when we look at what's taking place within the coral itself, these zooxanthellae, these endosymbiotic dinoflagellates, they are able to photosynthesize from sunlight and also getting carbon dioxide and water from their host in the surrounding area. They also get nutrients in the form of respiratory and metabolic wastes from the coral polyp. As these zooxanthellae produce excessive amounts of organic molecules, these are exported to the coral polyp, and that allows the coral polyp to break them down for energy, but in the process also release nitrates, phosphates, and carbon dioxide. Within the coral reef, there will be a few other primary producers, such as cyanobacteria, which are photosynthetic bacteria present on the reef, and these cyanobacteria also function as nitrogen fixers, converting dissolved nitrogen gas into nitrates. Seagrasses, mangroves, and seaweeds can also contribute to primary production in the form of detritus. Nitrogen and phosphorus waste products are efficiently recycled, not only by the corals and zooxanthellae, but also by the other reef dwellers. When we look at a typical coral reef food web, we can see that seaweeds and corals are the primary producers, and specifically the zooxanthellae within corals. Now, seaweeds and other communities can contribute to the detritus pool, and the detritus feeders feed directly on that, including sometimes the corals. There are organisms that graze on the corals themselves, organisms that feed on plankton, organisms that feed on detritus, and organisms that feed on the primary producers. And then we also have the predators, which feed on these primary consumers. It turns out that a variety of different types of organisms are able to feed directly on the coral or the coral products, including mucus produced by the coral, along with their reproductive cells. There is tough competition for space and light on the reef. Some corals grow fast and upright, others grow slow but massive, each in their own way trying to outcompete with others in their area. Corals may feed directly on or sting one another. If they contact each other or are running up against each other. Many coral reef inhabitants compete for space and or to deter predation by producing toxic or foul-tasting chemicals. These include soft corals and sponges. In this image, we see an intense war zone going on. There are 3 different species of corals growing into each other. There is chemical warfare, enzymatic destroying of tissues, and remarkable amounts of violence in the competition between these competing corals. One is attempting to grow over the other and killing its polyps along the way, whereas that central brown coral colony is also being attacked at the top by another neighboring coral colony. In a coral reef, other animals must also compete for limited resources. Many species of fish, mollusks, echinoderms, crustaceans, and members of other groups normally do this by feeding on slightly different foods, or feeding in slightly different areas, or feeding in slightly different ways or different times of the day. Sometimes they reproduce at different times of the year. Each species has its own well-defined ecological niche, and this is the reason that allows such diversity within a coral reef. Coral reefs are highlighted by a diverse number of species living together, surviving together in a surprisingly nutrient-limited environment. When we talk about things that shape the reef, coral predation and grazers play an important role in structuring the coral reef community. Some examples of coral predators include fish that directly eat the coral colonies, or one of the most devastating are the sea stars, specifically the crown of thorns sea star in the genus Acanthaster. This crown of thorns sea star can actually extrude its stomach from its mouth and surround a surface of a coral colony, digesting the polyps and the tissue, leaving behind nothing but the white skeleton. Seaweed grazers also play an important role of keeping seaweeds from taking over the coral surfaces and competing with the coral for light. Here we can see the result of a crown of thorns sea star feeding on a coral colony. And again, that white skeleton is really the calcium carbonate without the layer of organic tissue that otherwise would be providing its color. The crown-of-thorns sea star is a natural predator in the environment, and so many marine biologists are torn as to whether humans should influence these crown-of-thorns sea stars or not. Occasionally, they will occur in massive numbers and can decimate certain portions of the coral reef. So how do we deal with these massive waves of predators on the coral reef? Or should we be intervening at all? This is an area of debate within the field of marine biology right now. One argument is that these predators are natural, and interfering with the natural balance could be problematic. A further argument can be that corals can sometimes recover, or other corals can make use of this now vacated spot within the reef to grow themselves. On the other hand, we could argue that corals are already stressed and dealing with other challenges, and so these predators might just be too much. In the image, you can see a prototype ROV vehicle that can actually navigate through a coral reef, identify the crown-of-thorns sea star, and deliver a lethal injection to kill the predator. Is this something that we should be doing or not? The debate is still ongoing. And that completes our discussion of coral reefs. Now, next week, we're going to be talking about life in the open ocean, both nearshore and offshore. And so the question I want you to think about is, how comfortable is it swimming when you can't see the bottom? All right, see you next week.